All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, December 31st. And where do you want to start? We can talk about Russia, Ukraine, or the Middle East. Both of them, I think there's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, sure. Wherever you want to start. It's your call.
Okay. All right. Let's do the Middle East. I have two
Okay.
clips that I want to show you. So
Sure.
we'll start with this one.
Are you concerned that Israel is not moving quickly enough to phase two of the peace plan?
Well, I'm not concerned about anything that Israel's doing. I'm concerned about what other people are doing or maybe aren't doing. But I'm not concerned. They've lived up to the plan. They're strong, they're solid, and sometimes they don't understand when somebody violates something that you want to give them a second chance. Well, we'll give them a couple of second chances. But no, Israel's lived up to the plan 100%. Don't forget, we made the plan possible by taking out Iran. And speaking of Iran, I hope they're not trying to build up again, because if they are, we're going to have no choice but very quickly to eradicate that buildup. So I hope Iran is not trying to build up, as I've been reading that they're building up weapons and other things. And if they are, they're not using the sites that we obliterated, but they're using possibly different sites. We know exactly where they're going, what they're doing, and I hope they're not doing it because we don't want to waste the fuel on a B-2. It's a 37-hour trip both ways. I don't want to waste a lot of fuel. Okay?
Okay, so let's start with the Gaza peace plan part of that first.
Right.
So he's saying that, Israel's holding up, doing a great job. Where do you see this going in terms of for the Gazans and the peace plan moving forward? Is there a possibility to go to phase two now?
It's only a very remote possibility. And I just, the lie, that he just told there just is breathtaking. We've been discussing how Israel has not lived up to, its part of the ceasefire deal, not even close. Over 400 Gazans have been killed. They're killed every day. And again, over a third of them are children. A lot of them are women. The great majority are civilians. And it just, you go up and down the line, everything that Israel's supposed to do, it hasn't done, or it hasn't provided the humanitarian aid, the food, the medical supplies, the syringes, the excavation equipment, shelters, and we see the consequences for the Gazans. It's just, the violations have been blatant. They're just there every day, but Israel never pays a price for them. And we saw that, they didn't pay a price for it. In fact, we're told that they're living up to it 100%. So it's just the same old story. There's a double standard, one standard for Israel, another standard for the rest of the world. Israel can do what it wants. You sign a ceasefire, it can violate it every day, and the other side it can struggle to meet it, can actually very religiously comply with it, but it doesn't make any difference.
But
It's true, it's true whether you're talking about Lebanon or Gaza. So in the end, say, well, why, you might ask a question, why do any of these groups, Hezbollah or Hamas, why do they even sign ceasefires or agree to ceasefires? And the only answer is they know that Israel's going to violate them, but they're just the weaker party. And sometimes they just need to recuperate, and then Israel will slow down the attack on them. But they know they'll violate the ceasefire. They always do, and they're just doing it in a huge way in Gaza.
But aren't you surprised that Trump would say so forcefully that Israel's holding up to their end 100%? Because you were saying that Trump really wanted to go to phase two, and that this was going to be a lot of what they're talking about is the Gaza peace plan. And then there was this article that came out that said the Trump administration was upset with Netanyahu, and then it just seems like now they're complete in lockstep. Israel's perfect.
Yeah.
No pushback.
Right. Well, there's not in public. Maybe there's some in private, but in that press conference, it was almost a press conference scripted by Netanyahu. Basically, Trump gave him everything, or expressed support for every one of Netanyahu's pet projects, including his own pardon. He also expressed support for that. maybe there's some pushback behind the scenes, but why should there be? I mean, we should be. If you're going to pressure Israel, we should be open about it, right? There hasn't been any significant criticism, really criticism of any sort of, the daily ceasefire violations. So I guess I'm not surprised that he said that. Now, he does want to go ahead with Plan 2, but maybe part of his thinking is that, this is the way Trump looks at things, just pretend everything's okay and then move ahead. We're doing great, and then, now we're going to go to the next phase. I don't see it happening. I guess, partly because we get to the second phase, Israel doesn't, is going to be asked to do things that it does not want to do. There was actually a lot of pressure, of course, to make a deal so they could get the hostages back. And that was done. So that was actually very popular, within Israeli society. Not so popular with Netanyahu himself, but he said, okay, yeah, we'll do this. And then, okay, there's a ceasefire, but it's not a ceasefire. They continue to attack, right? And then they've also held on to something like 58% of the land. So they haven't really given anything up. The Israelis haven't. But they would be asked to give up something significant in the next phase. They would be asked actually to really surrender some of their control over Gaza, by letting this international stabilization force in. And then they're also supposed to withdraw farther back from the yellow line. These are things they don't want to do. So they're going to fight, but looking at this, I'm not very hopeful. The only way they could do it is if Trump came down on them like a ton of bricks. And we certainly didn't see that, right? We didn't see anything close to that.
Yeah, well, I'm a little confused because Trump says he wants this peace plan to succeed. His name's written is all over it. And so for it to succeed, it has to go to the next phase. Hamas, the people in Gaza, want it to go to phase 2 as well, because then they can get some more of their land back, and then they get this international peacekeeping force that would hopefully would see an end to this slaughter that happens on a daily basis. The only party that doesn't want phase 2 is Israel. So how is it that we're saying that we can have this peace plan go forward if we're saying Israel's back in 100%, and then Trump is going to? It's not going to happen, right? If it's going to fall through because Israel doesn't want it to go through, but somehow they're going to say it's Hamas's fault. How do they even spin that if it's clear that they're the ones that want it and it's Israel that's preventing it?
Right. Well, no, it doesn't make any sense, but it never does. It's just that, again, Trump is surrounded by Israel firsters. And they're spinning everything. They are probably telling him every day that, Hamas is doing these terrible things and Israel is again, living up to the plan 100%. And he maybe even really believes it. I don't know. And then, it's just like we've said before. Yeah, he wants this to happen. But the big question is, can he follow through on it? And with Trump, it just never seems like he does. There are people around him work on him. They always tell him that, this is, if you do this, this will help us actually implement the plan, when in fact it's going to destroy it. So, same thing is you need to escalate. You need to put more pressure on Hamas, let's bomb them some more or whatever. And then, you'll get your next phase. But of course you won't. Or we need to give the Israelis even more stuff, and that'll make them happier, and they'll do, the next phase. I think it's that. It's just it's being torn apart. The plan day by day, and if Trump doesn't wake up to the fact, and it'll die. I guess you can see some parallels to like what's happened in the past in negotiations over Ukraine. That Trump would come out like in Alaska and appear to agree with the Russians, and then they would get to work on it, and eventually seemed like came around completely on the other side. Now it looks like he's back with the Russians, right? And so maybe there's some reason to hope. It just I heard actually just reading a story this morning about apparently how he just blew up at Kellogg. I think Kellogg was feeding him a lot of lies, and he was buying it and he was believing it. And he was, he had strayed far away from what he had agreed to in Anchorage. But then at some point he realized, and he just told Kellogg to get the hell out. And, Kellogg's gone. And that, Maybe. The problem, he's up against so much more
Yeah.
in the case of Israel. It's not just a Kellogg and a few other characters. It's just like everybody around him. And then, even his own family. Let's be honest. And he's always been with the Zionists. So I'm not hopeful.
Right. It's his friend circle. So I don't think we can expect him to turn around. But these types of actions, when we see all these Israel firsters around him and Trump make these decisions, it's damaging Israel. I mean, nobody's done more damage to Israel than Netanyahu. Just what we've seen in Gaza. But then, I was on X and I was seeing Mark Levin. He's having a complete meltdown. I mean, he has been having a meltdown for the past 6 months, but he is really damaging the Israeli Zionist support base here in the U.S. I see comments under his unhinged rants that he's attacking Megyn Kelly all the time now. I see comments from people that would be like, I've listened to your show for 10 years, 20 years. You have actually turned me against Israel. People commenting that, like, I've always supported Israel, but Mark, you have turned me against them. Like, this is insane. And so just this level of just slavish behavior that we see is really damaging. I mean, it's getting to this point where I think everybody's just, you have to have your head in the sand to not recognize that there's something seriously poisonous, toxic with this relationship between Israel and the United States.
Right. Yeah. Right. And I think Mark Levine is he's symptomatic of a larger trend. He's one of many who's really undoing, many Israel firsters, fanatic Zionists that are really making the case against Zionism, just through their unhinged behavior. That's what we're seeing. There are just many cases. It happens every day, and it is opening eyes. We still have ways to go. Just to give you an example, there was a Turning Point USA conference recently. It took a poll and about Israel and whether Israel is an ally. I think it was 13% that said no, they're not. But then there was, I believe, the plurality was, well, they're just one of our allies, but not special. And then there was still like 1/3 that said, yeah, they're our best ally in the world. But so that's kind of disappointing. But I think people pointed out that actually shows a real shift. I mean, that in past years, it would be a majority. Yeah, they're our greatest ally on earth. And that has really shrunk. And there would have been just, 1% saying they're not an ally. So we are saying we have a ways to go. But it's moving, the tide is turning. And that's very encouraging.
Who did that poll? Do you know?
I don't know. I can't remember.
I don't trust these polls, especially when anything that touches Turning Point, I'm a little suspect because it seems to be a Zionist bastion entity. And I wouldn't be surprised if when they have these events, if they fund and pump in, Zionist pro-Israel.
Yeah, well, that's true. I was thinking the same thing. Right. And it may be like maybe a lot of the people who have turned against Israel are leaving Turning Point USA right now. After the Charlie Kirk's wife, her kind of cringe-inducing appearance, on Barry Weiss's show.
Just all these.
So I think that may be, but even so, it just shows that So I think that probably doesn't really capture the full extent of the change. But it shows the change even there, even with probably, all the efforts to bring in to kind of Zionize this organization again. They're still up against, a changing tide.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are also just afraid to express their opinions when it comes to Israel. And even though many have a sinking feeling like something is off, they don't want to bring it up. People aren't confrontational in general, but if we're talking about real support collapsing, we can move to the second part of that video that he was talking about is Iran. And if we really go through, and because he's saying that if Iran has conventional weapons, if they have ballistic, missiles, then, that's unacceptable and we'll have to go after them. Actually, that's part of the second clip. I want to show it to you. I'll show it to you real quick right now, and then we'll talk about it.
You support an attack, Israeli attack on Iran if Iran will not have a deal, if Iran will continue with their ballistic missiles and also nuclear weapons.
If they will continue with the missiles, yes. The nuclear, fast. Okay? One will be yes, absolutely. The other was, we'll do it immediately.
Mr. President,
Honor Farm from Channel 12.
Right.
Well,
Yeah, that's,
boy, it doesn't sound like a lot of wiggle room, but
Yeah.
we know Trump just says things, so I don't know if
Yeah.
we're locked into this now or not, but it sounds
Right.
like it.
yeah, no, that was an unambiguous reply. Earlier he was talking, we're going to knock them down hard or whatever, use that kind of language. And it wasn't clear if he was talking about the nuclear or the conventional, but he made it very clear there that, yeah, he's also talking about missiles. So look, the goalposts have been moved again. It's just that it used to be why, the reason that we had to attack Iran, that Iran was such a threat, was that it had this nuclear enrichment capability, which was completely legal and monitored. But, so what? Just like all the usual standards are thrown out the window when it comes to Israel. So we need to attack them, right? Because they could develop a bomb. But now it's not even that. You're just saying that, well, they just have a conventional deterrence capability. We need to attack them. It's just, I guess this is a country that's, is poised to attack Venezuela. So, obviously they're just not really, and has a history of attacking other countries on fabricated incidents or, non-existent facts. So we shouldn't be surprised, but it is, yeah, again, it's just really, kind of depressing to hear this. So, yeah, again, it looks like we're on a course. Who knows how long it'll take? As I pointed out earlier, okay, yeah, even Israel wants to attack Iran. They always want to attack Iran. And the U.S. is showing the willingness to support them. But it's not easy. Attacking Iran is not like attacking Gaza, killing kids in Gaza or blowing up somebody on a motorcycle in Lebanon. That's what, Israel does every day. You do that, there are no consequences. But if you attack Iran, there are consequences. And they could be very severe for Israel, for the world economy. We know that. And they demonstrated some of that capability last time, and they probably have an even greater capability. Now, of course, in the last war, the 12-day war, they were taken by surprise. They shouldn't have been, but they were obviously, were not expecting that attack. And Israel had laid the groundwork and attacked within the country, did a lot of damage. They're not going to be able to do that again.
Well,
so it's going to be harder. So, that's the thing, is they may want to, but there's still a question if they can.
Well, let's just not forget that they were attacked. Iran was attacked in the middle of negotiations.
Right.
The U.S. had scheduled the next step, and they
Yeah.
said it was promising,
Right.
for
That's
that
why
weekend.
They made the mistake of actually saying, well, they wouldn't go that far as to, we are in the middle of negotiations. I think they were thinking, well, when they call off the negotiations, we got to be ready for an attack. But that's not going to happen again. That's the thing. That's not going to happen again. Right.
Well, I just think it doesn't allow for any type of potential, treaty, a diplomatic process. Because if you did this in the last diplomatic process, in what world is it acceptable for Iran to come back and now say, okay, not even can we have any enriched uranium for our civilian nuclear program, which is completely within our rights. We are a signatory to the NPT, which Israel is not, and they have not only a civilian nuclear program, they have a weapons nuclear program. They have nuclear weapons. But now you're also saying that Iran can't even have conventional ballistic weapons on top of that. So, there's just the possibility of some type of deal. We shouldn't even mention that word. There is no deal to be made here. Right. You have just issued essentially, that we have set the course to war with Iran. And unless there's some turnaround from Trump, that's where we're headed right now.
Well, we seem to be headed in that direction, but there still is the obstacle of, the hard reality of Iranian deterrence. And so, they're going to work on it. They're going to try to, but it may be like we saw in past years, prior to this year, there were many times when it would seem like we're getting close to Iran, and then the U.S. and Israel drew back. And I think, again, it's just like they don't hesitate to attack these other countries, but they do hesitate to attack Iran because Iran can strike back. And so I think that Iran understands now that that's the only thing that can prevent an attack is actually its deterrent capability. And so Trump's saying, well, Iran has got to stop building up its missile arsenal. He's basically said that in not so many words, but Iran's thinking that's the only thing that's going to keep you from striking us is if we have a substantial missile arsenal. So they're going to do it, and it's just a question is, will we decide that that we can actually attack them, now or in the near future, before the arsenal becomes too large and not suffer any unacceptable consequences. So that's the whole thing. I'm sure they're making those calculations right now.
Right, but I mean, even if they strike now, Iran has a significant deterrent capability already, and they have the backing of countries like China and Russia. It doesn't matter when they attack them. If it's now or a year from now, the U.S. and Israel aren't going to walk away from it. But so basically what you said, though, is that, okay, they have the deterrence, but that's the only thing. We are on this collision course, and it's just the question is whether or not the deterrence is enough for Trump make a 180. And so that's basically the game we're playing now, right? We just got to wait and see. And unfortunately, Trump's mind doesn't seem to be that strong. He's surrounded by Zionists. They can probably feed him. And we saw what happened in the last one. He completely shut out Tulsi Gabbard, the DNI, and just took in Ratcliffe, which is an Israeli Mossad basically plant that runs the CIA. And he even said, like, I'm getting my own intelligence, which is Israeli intelligence. He wasn't even getting our, why are we spending hundreds of billions of dollars on our, surveillance state if Trump doesn't even use it? It's like you just get it from the Israelis anyways.
Yeah, and it's similar actually in the case, maybe he's now getting some good intelligence on Russia. You get the sense from his recent statements that he's starting to realize that what Putin was telling him was true. But for the longest time, I think he was just getting Ukrainian intelligence, or that's the intelligence that he was listening to.
Do you think that, if things pop up with Venezuela and it looks like, somehow, Israel gets its way and we bomb Iran again, and then this time I imagine Iran is not going to take it sitting down. Good chance that U.S. bases might be hit, all this. Do you think there would be a kind of a general revolt within our military? Because now there's serious, real consequences for all these men and women. Before, when we kind of went on these crusades around the world, there was a little bit of a risk for our soldiers, for U.S. troops, but for the most part, it's kind of like the Israel-Gaza situation, how we were doing a lot of things. Maybe not to that extent, obviously, but I mean, in terms of just the firepower, so we were able to walk away relatively unscathed, even though we inflicted tons of horrific damage on these countries. But if we get bogged down in Venezuela and we get bogged down in Iran, I imagine that just regular everyday soldiers will just start to ask, like, wait a second, my friends are dying. I might die now. Why are we here? What is the point of this? How is this protecting my country? They said, Trump said it was a 37-hour flight. That shows you that it's on the opposite side of the world. That is not how is this protecting the homeland? And then you do this and the Strait of Hormuz gets closed and gas prices skyrocket. So, I mean, none of it makes sense. Do you think that's a possibility that our military personnel?
Well, at some point, I don't think we're anywhere close to that now. But Trump has shown like actually previous presidents as well. They're very reluctant to, again, have the boots on the ground. They do want to strike from afar. They want to minimize casualties. It's just the question is, if they get involved in either or both of these wars, can they actually avoid the casualties? Because, again, maybe things won't work out, and I'm sure they won't work out in Venezuela the way they want. There may be the temptation then to start inserting troops on the ground, and then we have a huge mess. I don't know that it will go that way, but there is that risk. Once you start unleash the dogs of war, you just don't know where it's going to go. And then, of course, Iran has the capability of striking U.S. military bases in Iraq and Syria. Actually, they're within easy range of Iranian missiles, and could do a great deal of damage, cause a lot of casualties if they so choose. They could potentially sink a ship or ships, So, yeah, then at that point, we have a real problem on our hands. And again, I guess one thing that we should just hope for is that, okay, that Trump doesn't want to go there. You know, he has shown a healthy fear of those kind of entanglements. He likes the quick bombing mission, that kind of thing, the missile strike. But maybe again, and especially in the case of Iran, there's no guarantee that you can limit it to, to such a narrow scope. And you may end up with, significant casualties. I'm sure, I hope, is that there are people around him saying, hey, there's could be a real downside to this. And that's something that I think has a healthy fear of.
Yeah, I just feel like the people that have to be thinking about this harder than anybody are men and women that are on these military bases throughout surrounding Iran. It's just surely maybe the everyday person, low private's not thinking about it that much, but surely some of the commanders, they have to understand. And when they see, Trump make this statement and saying, yeah, well, we're going to, Iran can't have any weapons. We got to go blow them up. And they're like, well, wait, if we do that, those weapons will be used on us, right? We are the lambs to the slaughter here. Like there has to be, I just feel like if you're out there long enough, eventually that thought is going to have to enter your mind, right? And then that's going to cause a problem.
Yeah, potentially it could. We're not there yet, but yeah, potentially it could.
Okay, well, do you think that, if it starts looking like we're actually going to do this, that we might actually strike Iran's ballistic missile system, conventional depots or whatever, what do you think Iran's response at this time that has their rhetoric changed where they are no longer, afraid to confront the United States now that they're at this point where it's like, we don't have a choice. This is just going to keep on happening. So, the U.S. has to get out of this region and Israel has to be destroyed because it is clear that the U.S. and Israel are hell-bent on destroying Iran.
Yeah, well, my understanding is, again, that well, first of all, Iran is still more united than it has been in a long time. That was a result of the 12-day war, the attacks by both Israel and the U.S. And the leadership since then, with some exceptions, Pezeshkian, I think he's a very nice guy, but maybe you don't really want a very nice guy, leading a country in these circumstances. But, in spite of Pezeshkian's, maybe softness, there have been many statements from the Iranian leadership. It's like, if you think, don't even think about attacking us again, because if you attack us, we're going to hit back a lot harder than we did last time.
And is that directed at the United States as well?
It's mainly directed at Israel, but the truth is that they understand when you're talking about Israel, you're also talking about the U.S., and they have to be prepared for both. And they have prepared for these kind of attacks. That's why they have all these underground facilities. They understand their own weaknesses. They understand the strengths of the enemy. And that's why they've gone with this program of drones and missiles and underground facilities, which is, it plays to their strengths and kind of denies us some of our advantages. Similar, on a much greater and more advanced scale than what the Houthis did in Yemen.
I know nobody wants a direct war between Iran and the United States because it would be catastrophic for both countries, for the whole world, and especially the region. But do you think there's a possibility then that if it seems like Israel wants to use the United States to attack Iran? But if Iran says that, look, we know that it's Israel that's telling you to do this. If you carry this out, the United States, we won't attack your bases, but we'll start blowing up stuff in Israel now. That's what it is. Because we know why this attack is happening. You are just the instrument that's being used, but it's being directed out of Tel Aviv. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we're going to hit. And so Americans, even though you attacked us, you're safe because we don't want to blow up the whole world. I mean, we understand that risk, but understand, you hit this, we're going towards the command and control center, which unfortunately is Tel Aviv. Do you think that's possible? And then I would be like, all right, go for it. Go for it, Israel. Do it. And let's see what happens,
Yeah, well, that's possible. No, I think that kind of thinking is not alien to the Iranians. They understand that very well. And so, sure.
And if they said it, then Trump might be more okay with it. It's like, okay, well, at least I'm safe, and then maybe this can solve my problem. Like, hey, this is one way to get rid of the blackmail. Or just if it's all flat. No, I'm just joking. Well, or maybe I'm not. I don't know. But it's a possibility. I just feel like if you're Iran, I feel like you know where this is heading at some point. Israel will not stop. They just won't stop. And you've been trying to work with what you thought might have been the head of what controlled Israel, the United States, but you're realizing maybe it's the other way around. And so now, why sit around and wait for them to hit first? Maybe you're looking. Something that I've always been wondering about and frustrated with is why doesn't Iran say, for example, that if the Gaza genocide doesn't stop, if Israel does not move to phase 2 and continues to violate it, then we will intervene. You said they were willing to do that with Hezbollah. Like if Israel invaded Lebanon again, that Iran would intervene, come to the defense. Why can't they make some kind of ultimatum with Gaza as well?
I don't know. I don't have an answer. Again, it's their country, and the consequences of those kind of promises are going to mean lost lives and destruction within their own country. So I'm not going to criticize any country for failing to go to war with Israel in the region. The one group that has, and I think our hats are off to them, of course, is the Houthis. But maybe that's because in a lot of ways they just didn't have much to lose. They're just such a poor country with very little infrastructure that actually made it easier. The Iranians have a lot to lose. Let's put it that way.
No, I think that's true. Before we move over to the Ukraine, is there any update with the Somaliland project?
Just a very brief one. Actually, I think one of our viewers suggested a video I looked at, and I'll just very briefly summarize it as saying that, well, this was actually kind of a really bad move on the part of Israel, and that by doing so, the Houthis have them boxed in. And I think that's overstated, but it is important to acknowledge, I agree, that the Houthis have a say in this. That if the Israelis start to move to build a base or some other facilities in Somaliland, the Houthis are nearby, and I'm sure that they'll have a say. In other words, that they'll fire their missiles and their drones and make it difficult. Either for the Somaliland government, such as it is, maybe just the risk of that may cause the Somaliland government to have second thoughts. The big question is, what role the U.S. will play. And maybe we got a foretaste of that in the UN Security Council on Monday. There was a vote held on the Somaliland recognition by Israel, and 14 of the 15 members voted to condemn Israel for its recognition. Of course, one country cast a dissenting vote, and of course that was the United States. So will the U.S. follow up? Possibly, and if the U.S. and the Israel together are committed to actually building facilities there, can the Houthis stop them? I don't know that they can. That there is a real risk that will happen. We'll see. I would just say that this is kind of like the recognition is an opening move. And we may see more conflict. Again, the Houthis are going to do what they can. It's just not clear who's going to come out on top. It remains to be seen. I just want to also comment, the Israelis justified their recognition on the grounds, on humanitarian grounds. It was actually in terms of human rights. They said that the poor people in Somaliland had been subjected to attacks that targeted civilians, that caused the destruction of cities. And, obviously Israel can't stand for that. And so they had to recognize them. Other people, no comment. We all know how,
Unbelievable.
I know,
Unbelievable.
Right. The chutzpah, I guess, is what you call it. And then as South Africa pointed out, that just the irony, the hypocrisy of Israel recognizing, being the only one to recognize this country, and when the whole, the rest of the world has recognized the Palestinian state right there. The Israelis can't find themselves within themselves to recognize that Palestinian state. So and again, the hypocrisy stinks to high heaven.
Yeah, well, we're just such a benevolent country. We just want to help these poor people in Somalia. It's absurd. Okay, well, let's move over to Ukraine and Russia. So the big news is this drone attack that was on Putin's residence. And when I first saw it, it was just like, okay, yeah, that's par for the course. I've seen things kind of like this before in the past. I've seen drone attacks that go into St. Petersburg or into Moscow or the Kremlin. Remember there was that helicopter in Kursk, that Putin was in Kursk in a helicopter and it flew through a Ukrainian drone storm. And there was this big talk about another assassination on his life. And Budanov has openly said that, yeah, we've tried to kill Putin and that's part of our... So I was just like, this is par for the course. But then the response that I've seen has been actually more elevated than I expected, because I was like, okay, this is bad. I know it's bad, but Ukraine does this stuff a lot. So, but here the response has been like, okay, this is not, we won't respond diplomatically to this, which, is completely understandable. But then I'm also seeing the Ukrainian efforts to say that this wasn't them, that it was Russia doing themselves. They seem to be scared because it almost to me feels like Russia's wanting an excuse now to go harder. Am I misinterpreting that? Was this a serious event, or do you think there's something true to what I kind of?
Yeah, well, there's been a change in tone. Yeah, that from in the Kremlin that has been noticeable in the last, let's say, couple of months. There's been a real obvious change in tone in the way that Putin and Lavrov and the others talk about Ukraine. It's just it seems like the willingness to compromise, to be patient, to pursue the diplomatic course has pretty much evaporated. So I think this is it's not surprising that you're getting this response, from the Kremlin this time. And we saw it in the case, for example, of the attacks on the civilian tankers. Immediately, Putin said that this is unacceptable and there will be a response. And then there was. It's like in the past we've seen, then they send another 500 drones and 30 missiles like they do all the time, and they call it a retaliation. They really didn't retaliate, right? That's what we saw as a response to previous terrorist attacks, or attacks on civilians in Russia or in the Donbass. But this time we got an obvious escalation, and that was the attack on Odessa, which is ongoing and has really just been very destructive. They really have shut down Odessa and the port there, it appears. So that was, I think you saw right there, really a new policy. I think it's just, that it was clear that for the longest time, this is, almost, we're getting near to 4 years, that the Russians were looking for a diplomatic off-ramp. That was clear from the day one, right? And then things have, it turned into a much larger conflict than they had anticipated, but they still were looking for ways to negotiate. And I think at this point they've really given up on it. They just know that it's not going to happen, and so they're not going to show the kind of restraint that they've shown before. And I think we will see a real response, an obvious retaliation for this attack, which was, again, actually, when it first happened, it wasn't really. I kind of wondered, did this really happen? Because there just wasn't any evidence for it, which is what the Western media was saying. I knew, of course, that certainly the Ukrainians were capable of, because they have a record of doing these things. So it's just it's not like, the Ukrainians couldn't possibly do that. But we didn't see anything. But today, actually, they came out with a map showing the flight paths, and I'm sure those are things that can be corroborated by Western intelligence. And they did show a photograph of a downed drone. Now, that's not going to convince anybody because there it is in a snowy field. But that's what I was thinking ahead of time. If they managed to shoot down all 91, which is not surprising because we have actually seen that happen. Like there's some massive attacks on Moscow where they just shoot down maybe, 125 out of 126 or something like that. Because they have very, very strong air defenses in places like Moscow. And I'm sure they would have very, very strong air defenses around a residence of Putin. I think this is actually the Valdai residence in Novgorod. So yeah, they shot them all down, but that means if they shot them all down, they actually dropped before they got to the residence. So it's going to be in a field somewhere, and that's not going to convince anybody. But okay, yeah, that's what you would expect. So, so anyway, right? I think we are going to see a serious retaliation. That the Russians have lost their patience.
Yeah. If those drones blew up when they got hit, though, there may not be too much to recover.
Yeah,
well,
that's right. I think that the picture they showed, that was one that actually was still intact, so they could show it. But a lot of them are just going to be fragments, because they blew up in the sky. Right.
Well, we know that the West is always wanting to just believe the Ukrainian side of the story constantly. But there are a few instances when they know that it's a major escalation that they don't. One example that we give is when there was the missile that landed in Poland and killed a farmer or two farmers.
Right.
And immediately Zelensky was like, oh, this is, you got to enact Article 5, Putin's firing missiles into Poland, and then the West was silent. I know that Trump believes the Russian side, but have the rest of the European, are they saying that they believe the Ukrainian story? Because that would, if they don't even come to Ukraine's defense there, then I think that we can just say that, okay, yeah, the Russians.
I don't know what they're saying right now, but in the immediate aftermath, Western media was speaking with one voice. They were echoing the Ukrainian position, which is not surprising. I think the change from the past is that this time Trump actually seems to have listened to Putin on this and has expressed, belief in what he said. In the past, even Trump didn't do that. So this is a change. It seems like we'll see how permanent the change is, but it seems like Trump is really, after getting rid of Kellogg, I think that was a very significant event, has really settled down, has adopted basically the Russian understanding of events. Now, what Trump can do about it, how much control he has over his own, military and intelligence remains to be seen. But I think it is actually rather significant that he expressed his shock about the Ukrainian attack and just said this was really stupid. Because we've had so many of these in the past, and you never got those kind of comments from any Western leader. This time we got one from Trump.
Yeah, and much of the leaders throughout the world that aren't part of the collective West have voiced to condemn this attack. So it sounds like most of the world is believing the Russian side of this story, that this was indeed an attack. But if this was a drone attack, the other big question is were we involved? Do we have to? Are we involved in these long range drone attacks into Russia?
A lot of people say I don't know enough about it to say. It's clear that the Ukrainians can launch drones in whatever direction they want, and we don't have to be involved. But for the drone attack to be successful, Western support is probably necessary, because what we do is that we provide them with coordinates so that the drones can evade air defense. We look for gaps in Russian air defense. We find them. We let the Ukrainians know where they are, and then the drone will maybe follow a zigzag course to the target. And looking at this, maybe the reason that all 91 were shot down was because actually we did not supply them with that data. So, they just sent them towards Novgorod, and half of them apparently were shot down in the Bryansk region close to the Ukrainian border. And then the other half, roughly, were shot down within Novgorod as they approached Putin's residence there. So it's not it's certainly a possibility. Again, like Budanov is very, very close, has very close ties to the CIA. And again, the CIA, I think is probably not at all happy with Trump, and they want to do their own thing. And so there's nothing to prevent them from trying to, unfortunately, from trying to help the Ukrainians with their various, asymmetric warfare missions.
Right. I mean, well, this is our war too. If we're the part of the intelligence and we're in there talking to them constantly, then these people are emotionally invested. Our CIA, the people that have been working on this, they're emotionally invested, and they've been working with these people, and they probably even formed good relations with a lot of these people that have been killed. And then they're like for them, it's like losing their comrades in the war too.
Right.
I just imagine that they will do what they can, and they have certain
that's a good
powers.
point. No, the relationship is very close. It started pretty much the day after. I think it was literally the day after the coup in 2014. The CIA was called in, and they actually were asked to build up a whole new intelligence network from scratch within Ukraine, and they did. So the Ukrainian intelligence and CIA intelligence they're very closely linked. And Budanov, is for obvious reasons, because he is the head of military intelligence, the GUR in Ukraine. He's very closely tied to the CIA. So it's certainly possible that the CIA was involved in this. We'll probably never know for sure, but it's there's good reason to be suspicious.
Right. I mean, how many CIA bases were there in Ukraine prior to the war? I saw it in the New York Times.
Yeah, it was roughly a dozen, right along the border with Russia or Russian occupied territory. They're being used to apparently both for surveillance, but even for special operations.
Right. So
just launch points for special operations.
And you said they built it all from scratch too. So you how invested the CIA, if there's any, is. I mean, there's no number of these types of bases in any other country in the world, other than the United States, of course. They have a dozen. I think most of them have
there might
one
be,
or two.
But
I think we looked
unusual.
it up.
Yeah, I think there may be one or other two countries where you have something similar, but yeah, it is unusual. It is unusual. It's an outlier.
So we're just very heavily invested in this. And you just imagine we built it from the ground up, and we got all of our guys in there. The amount of communication between Ukraine and the United States via the CIA, the intelligence agencies, and the Pentagon has to be extensive. And it's been going on for 11 years. So yeah, I think that network is incredibly tight. And so we shouldn't underestimate the amount of that our government is emotionally invested in this war, that and MI6, they all are. Then this is one of the reasons it's just so difficult, is because they've been working with these, this for 11 years and building these very, very close relationships, that on a monetary level, on an emotional level, a political level, all these things. So I think that's why it's so tough for us to get out, is because we're way more involved than we want to admit.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. That's one reason why, again, I just don't know how much control Trump has over his own, his own people, let's say, that he may want to walk away from it, but they're not going to walk away from it.
Right.
They're still going to be there.
So what do you think Putin should do, in terms of this retaliation? Is it?
I don't know. Maybe an arrestnik, maybe an assassination of a fairly high-level, official within Ukraine. There's been some talk and some suspicion that the Russians have carried out assassinations in Ukraine, but it's not clear that it's happened. Earlier this year, there was Parubi, the notorious ultra-nationalist that had been involved in all kinds of was very much involved in the coup in 2014, just to name one incident. A very important figure in the ultra-nationalist scene. He was assassinated in Lvov, I believe, in western Ukraine. And then there was suspicion that the Russians were behind it, because he was also involved in the Odessa massacre. So the Russians would have a real reason. A lot of Russians were hoping that their own government was behind it, because this was a guy that they felt really needed to pay the price for what he had done. But they caught somebody who confessed, and it's not clear that there's any kind of Russian connection. So we don't know if that the Russians have actually engaged in any kind of assassinations. But maybe this will change things. Maybe this new rhetoric we hear is going to be is a sign that we will see that the Russians are going to start fighting back in this so-called dirty war.
Yeah, there's been multiple times where there have been incidents, like one of them where we mentioned the Kursk helicopter that Putin was in, and there was this drone swarm that was directed at it, or that it flew through.
Yeah, well, there's some argument it may have been,
coincidence.
actually, it's coincidence, just crossed paths or something. Who knows?
Yeah.
But the important thing is, Bolunov himself has actually said that they have tried to assassinate Putin on more than one occasion. I mean, that's an admission from the head of the GUR in Ukraine. So I think that's all we need right there.
Right. Well, there have been multiple incidents where Russia has said there would be some form of retaliation, and many of us in the dissident community assumed like, okay, is this going to be when our Russians going to be used, some type of escalation in the war? And usually, what it is just more of actually what Russia was doing already, and maybe they sent an extra 20 drones on the next package. And so, but you're saying that you think that we're in a different phase based on what happened in Odessa and just the response.
Yeah. Right. So the rhetoric has really changed, and I think that's significant. It's not just, it's not just one official. It's Putin, it's Lavrov, it's all of them. It's not just Medvedev, who is always threatening, hell and destruction, but it's the rest of them. They haven't reached Medvedev levels, but they're there. But they have ratcheted up the rhetoric, and we did see a real significant retaliation that's ongoing in Odessa. Nothing minor. So I do fully expect that we will see something this time. I believe that we've entered a new phase.
Yeah, I think Russia has to. I mean, it's absurd that I think they should have been doing this earlier. When we said that there would maybe be a more impactful, forceful retaliation, and it doesn't happen. And part of the reason I think is during that time there were all these attempts at negotiations, some peace talks and whatnot. Right. But I think they also have the political cover here as well, with Trump being pissed off and saying, well, whatever happens, essentially, Ukraine, that's on you. That was a big mistake. Don't do it. I do expect something as well. And, maybe in Areshnik, we'll see another one used. But there's another thing that is being kicked around is that Russia might actually declare war. And does this really matter? The semantics, we have the SMO, and then they say that, okay, now we're serious, we're declaring war. Do you think that this is, first of all, does it matter, and is it something that you think they would actually do?
I think it does. I mean, the SMO so far, well, first of all, in spite of all of its characterization as a full-scale invasion, it wasn't at the start. It was really a very limited invasion, and then it's ratcheted up, but it's still at a level where, like, if you're in Russia, you don't know that there's a war going on, and that is intentional on part of Putin and the Russian government. They have made a conscious choice to keep this limited, not an outright war. So I imagine if it is declared as a war, that would mean, I think, first of all, maybe constraints would be thrown off in regards to targets within Ukraine, because they haven't gone after, decision-making centers, for example. And they really haven't gone after, well, they have increased it, the attacks on the infrastructure, but they still haven't gone after, there are a lot of other things they could go after, like bridges. They haven't done that yet. Maybe there's another reason they haven't. There's an argument about that. But, above all, they haven't really mobilized the population. They haven't put in spite of what you hear in the West, they have not put the economy on a wartime footing. Maybe a declaration of war would make at least all those things possible.
Well, it doesn't make sense to me. I mean, first of all, there's no need for Russia to mobilize. They have more than enough men. They have the largest standing army in the world that is that is battle hardened. They don't need to mobilize to win in Ukraine, and neither they need to put their economy on a wartime footing. And then also, if they say war, I think it's just a bad move in general, because the Europeans and the Americans and people in the West would just scoff at it for the most part and be like, "What are you talking about? You guys have been at war all the time, anyways. What are you saying? Oh, now you've boxed yourself into some major escalation because you've declared, made this big statement that this is something bigger, and now you have to go big, and you don't want to box yourself into that. Just go." Have complete control. Why change it? If you want to hit more infrastructure, hit more infrastructure. You can do that. You don't have to change the terminology.
Right. I think you're right. There's no reason to do it unless you had already made the decision to substantively change, the war effort to escalate in a very substantial way, and then maybe in concert with that, you would make a declaration of war. But there's no reason to declare it unless you've already made that firm decision. And I don't think there's really any sign of that right now. We're just talking about a response to this one attack on a residence in Novgorod.
Right. Yeah, I would say I would only expect a true declaration of war is if NATO is getting directly involved. If there are troops on the ground and now there's Poles and French getting killed, then it's like, okay, then it's like,
I think you're right.
It's time to move to South Africa and, hope for the best, if that happens. Let's, do you think that could happen?
Yeah. Well, we've talked about it many times. It could. Again, I just say like I've said in previous episodes, I pin my hopes on the very weakness of the Europeans. They want to, clearly they love talking about it. But when push comes to shove, I don't think they really have the capabilities, and that may prevent them from actually doing it in the end. Yeah.
Europe, all they have is their pride, their former pride, their former glory. Yeah. That's it.
Right.
But it can't run a country on that. It doesn't work, Before we end, you were saying that you wanted to talk a little bit more about the White Rex story, right? There was some more to that, or
actually, just wanted to expand on that a bit because I think it's important. Again, one of the stated objectives of the SMO is denazification. And sometimes, that's ridiculed in the West. How can that be? There's a Jewish president or whatever. There are no Nazis, though before Western media used to admit that there were Nazis. So what is this? There are, yes, let's say many people that self-identify as Nazis in Ukraine. And many of them are Russians or even, either actually from Russian Federation or are ethnic Russians in Eastern Ukraine. White Rex is one of them. He was born in Russia. He spent the first 17 years of his life in Russia. I think later he went back to Russia. In the end, he was actually wanted for acts of violent crime in both the EU and Russia. But he was clearly, a Nazi. He identified himself as a Nazi. This is a word that's thrown around a lot, and a lot of people are called Nazis in America, and the great majority of them are not, are not even, are not neo-Nazis or anything like it. But there are people in that part of the world, especially, we're talking about Russia and Ukraine, that actually do identify, with the Nazi party under Hitler, and White Rex was one of them. Just to give you an example, he like a lot of people in these neo-Nazi organizations, he was a big fan of Tarrant, the perpetrator of the Christchurch massacre in 2019, in which approximately 50 Muslim worshippers were killed by him. He conducted the massacre. He live streamed it, and White Rex loved the guy like a lot of these people, sang his praises, celebrated his act. Translated his manifesto into Russian. These are the kind of people we're talking about, people that really do glorify violence, who glorify, violence, especially against ethnic minorities. That's what they're about. It's not just a term of abuse. These are the sort of people that we're talking about. Now, if you go back, let's say 25 years, you would say without question that certainly the center of Slavic Nazism and maybe even global Nazism was in Russia. When Putin took power, it was a real problem. I've spoken to Chinese in Moscow who said, yeah, they remember those days and it was scary. You see these skinheads coming towards you, and if you're Chinese or an obvious foreigner, ethnic minority, you try to avoid them because they would beat you up, or even worse possibly. They were a real presence, and but once Putin took power, he began cracking down on them. So throughout the 2000s, you had these Russian Nazis actually fleeing to Ukraine. That was a place where they're welcome. They weren't subject to these crackdowns, and that accelerated after 2014. White Rex himself was actually a big champion of the Euromaidan. Again, because the ultra-nationalists were really the muscle that made that happen. They were the ones that really carried out the coup, and then they ended up gaining great influence in the government and especially the military afterwards. So we had the creation of the Azov battalion, which is now a huge family. We're talking about, many different military formations. And the Azov is largely, not entirely, but actually sort of an Eastern Ukrainian phenomenon, where so a lot of the people there are Russian-speaking. In a very broad sense, this is to simplify things. It's just like when you go to Western Ukraine, you're talking about Banderites. And then if you're in Eastern Ukraine and talking about ultranationalists there, you're talking about actually people who, above all, identify with Nazism. And that's true of a lot of the Azov battalions. So there's a great deal of overlap. It's not like, okay, a Banderite is one thing and a neo-Nazi is another. The two groups have a lot in common, and a lot of those people have associate with themselves with both Nazism and with Bandera. And later we're going to talk about Bandera in greater detail, and we'll see why that is. But there is some differences between East and West in Ukraine, and because you do have more Russian speakers, and so sometimes the Russian-speaking ultranationalists do get annoyed or irritated by the linguistic chauvinism of the Western Banderites, because they are doing what they can to suppress the Russian language and having a great deal of success, at least officially, in the country. And that's something that the ultranationalists there on the eastern side, and a lot of them in Azov, are irritated by. And we had a case of that. There was a woman named Irina Farion. It was roughly a year ago that she was assassinated. She was an extreme Banderite, linguistic nationalist. She was just devoted to the cause of the Ukrainian language and of just suppressing Russian. So she was assassinated, and immediately says, well, the Russians are behind it. Well, the group that claimed credit for it was called National Socialist White Power, which is obviously a Nazi group that does exist in Russia, but it also exists in Ukraine, and it has much more, let's say, freedom to operate within Ukraine. It's really being cracked down hard within Russia. So first of all, I think it's good to be aware of that. Of this difference between East and West within Ukraine. They're all ultra-nationalists. They have a lot in common. There's a big overlap, but there are some differences, and occasionally there are these spats, that can result in an assassination, as happened in this case. Now, some people will point out and say, well, the Russians, they have their Nazis too, and it's true. But again, they have cracked down, and that's the reason that they've been fleeing to Ukraine. They have been working to suppress these organizations and arrest their leaders and so on and so forth. But there is, in fact, an ultra-nationalist or, more than one ultra-nationalist unit fighting on the Russian side. That's kind of a mirror image of like what you see Azov on the other side. And so how do you explain that? Is this well, what it comes down to is that the Russians have gotten rid of a lot of these people, but there's still some of them. And the argument, there's one group called Rusich that actually formed in 2014, when the Civil War broke out. it wasn't the only ideological, military unit. There were also actually left populist ones and communist units, within Donbass. But there was this one ultra-nationalist, which still exists, Rusich. And the thinking on the part of the Russians is say, well, they could just flee to Ukraine and then fight on the other side against us and kill our guys. But maybe we can use them here to actually, further our ends. So they keep them. It's a small unit, first of all. I can't compare with Azov. Like Azov, just the 3rd Army Corps, that's just one military formation in the Azov family has now roughly 50,000 soldiers in it. It's very large. When you're talking about this Rusich, maybe it's 100 or 200. It's actually pretty tiny. And then the Russians keep it on a tight leash. They will post things online that are very ultra-nationalist and violent in nature and maybe directed against ethnic minorities within Ukraine, or talk about killing, Ukrainian prisoners of war or whatever. They'll delete those things, and they've arrested a lot of occasionally, it seems like periodically, they'll arrest some leader, that's strayed too far. So I think that the thinking is we keep them on a tight leash and we actually use them. It's better to have them there on the front line, not within our society, but neither on the other side killing our men. So they have one. There was a larger, similar ultra-nationalist group called Española that was created in 2022. And the guy who created it in Russia just said, well, okay, he was associated with these soccer hooligans, which often soccer hooligans actually feed into these, ultra-nationalist groups throughout the world, not just Russia and Ukraine. He said there's very strong pro-Ukrainian sentiment. We need to do something, because he was an ultra-nationalist himself, but he was also still loyal to the Russian government. So he created Española and started recruiting these hooligans. Don't go to Ukraine, come and join, my unit there. Now, Española was there. It was larger, I think, than Rusich, but not, again, you couldn't compare with anything you had on the Ukrainian side, and maybe had a couple hundred. But it was shut down. It was actually disbanded just a couple of months ago. And the head of it, the guy, I think his name was Stanislav Orlov, he was known as the Spaniard for some reason. He was killed resisting arrest just a couple of weeks ago. So again, you see a real crackdown and very tight controls on these groups on the Russian side. And but you see them, again, fleeing again and again, and kind of contributing to a real Nazi problem on the Ukrainian side.
So these groups you mentioned, like Rusich and Española, they're Ukrainian nationalists, right? So what are they?
No, they're actually, they're Russians.
Right, Russian, but I mean,
but so they're Russians. A lot of these people, the majority, I think is fair to say, since starting in the 2000s, have been going to Ukraine, because Ukraine, they can thrive. They're not harassed by the police, and they can actually, take up arms and, with the full support of the government. So the great majority, or a majority of them has gone there. But a few, I think, again, the thinking on the Russian side, and I don't know. I don't know if this is actually a wise thing to do, is to say, we'll use some of these people. Let's let them not all go to Ukraine. The ones we'll get them, first of all, out of society where they cause problems. Put them on the front line and have them, fight the Azov on the other side of the line.
So basically, we got Russian Nazis, small Russian Nazi groups that are fighting Ukrainian Nazi groups.
Yeah, much larger ones, on the other side. But again, like the largest one was Española, and that was disbanded. So it may be that whole idea is coming to an end. Now, another thing it kind of raises a question, like, what was Wagner all about, under Prigozhin? Because there was only one, one of the very, very few organizations within Russia that openly supported Wagner during the insurrection was Rusich. And there clearly were ties between Rusich and Wagner. So there was just a lot of questions. I've never really fully understood that whole episode.
It was a weird one.
It really was weird, but I think it was something part of a similar phenomenon. And it was back then, the Russians, knew that this was kind of a dangerous force, but they hoped they could channel it, and they used it in the, while they were building up their regular forces, they used this, let's say, kind of nationalist and kind of rather violent force within Russia, to wage war on the front lines in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's kind of a dark calculation, but it is kind of killing two birds with one stone, right? You're like, okay, we'll throw these Nazis in the meat grinder first into Bakhmut. And just the tactics that we saw Wagner use were a little bit more meat grinder-ish. Like, let's throw them right in the front. It wasn't the slow pincer moves. I mean, I think we saw that most in places like Bakhmut. It was just from pretty heavy casualties. So, I mean, on both sides. But that's when we're really seeing a lot of parity in terms of the death counts, between the Russians
Like
and
if you look back at the Media Zona records, that's one place where it really clearly spiked on the Russian side. It was during the Bakhmut campaign.
Right, definitely. Well, you said that the whole denazification thing, a lot of people in Europe and in the West, everywhere in the West, they kind of scoff at it. And I think the reason they scoff at it is you're saying if this Nazi problem is so large, it's just not highlighted enough. I don't understand why it isn't. If this is something that Putin and the Russian government really want to, say that this is a real problem, and they need to make it a little bit clearer to the rest of us how you attempt to denazify the problem, and also to provide more evidence to the rest of the world that this is a serious problem, because there is evidence, but it just seems like the Russians they don't really care about it.
Well, they do talk about it. I think I'm sure they could do a better job of highlighting it, but they do talk about it. It is a common topic within Russia, but it just does not get reported in the West. And it's just, again, it's very blatant. It used to be that there was discussion of this problem within Western media, in mainstream Western media. And then it just ended. After 2022, and it's just like, that doesn't exist anymore. It does. White Rex, and just to give you an example, his death is being commemorated around the world. He was a global figure. All the actual Nazis out there know who he was, and they have had their torchlight parades, and they're spraying graffiti, say we're going to take revenge for his death. And now within Ukraine, this is something that should be noted too, is that he was given gushing, White Rex was giving all kinds of gushing obituaries that followed his death, written by liberal nationalists. The kind of people that run, the anti-corruption agencies, for example. This is a strange phenomenon where we're finding a fusion of liberalism and ultranationalism. But they sang his praises. And the thing is, there's just no question who he was. If you go, even if you go on Wikipedia and look up White Rex, it just said straight out, this is, which Wikipedia is always very strongly skewed to the mainstream and the West establishment point of view. But there's just so much overwhelming evidence. It's just, he had his own line of neo-Nazi merchandise, and he himself again said, this is what I'm all about. And all of them, love, the Tarrant, the perpetrator of the Christchurch massacre. There's just no hiding it yet. He gets these gushing obituaries, and within the liberal press in Ukraine, and that spills over the liberal press on our side. We've chosen not to look at it, and we just won't think about it. But it's there. It's a real problem. So when the Russians are talking about denazification, it's something that they've actually kind of carried out in their. It was never as such a problem in their own society as it became, within Ukrainian society. But it is something that they struggled with and are mopping up now. And then in Ukraine, it's right there. I mean, the military, I don't think you quite say the government. The government's actually in a way dominated by the liberals, but the liberals are in tight alliance with these people. But the military is really led by these ultranationalists who have openly associate themselves with the Nazis in different ways.
What I think Russia needs to do then is they need to just present to the world in a nice package, make an announcement like, here's the evidence of this problem, and here's how we're going to solve it. the Nazi problem. I think that would help a lot. Do you think that we'll see something like that they can do something like that?
I don't know. It would be ignored. It would be scoffed at, and there would be all
Would
kinds
it?
of,
I mean, if they made it a big statement like, look, this is just in a nice, it's about packaging, so that people can understand that there is this problem, because the fact of the matter is that most people don't, in the West. But if Russia clearly says, okay, I'm going to be doing this, this, and this because of this, here's the evidence, and then people would start to be able to put two and two together once those things start happening. You're like, okay, well, now I see why they're saying it, and this is what it just feels like Russia hasn't done a good job at all.
They just don't seem to understand or really care about the information war. And in a way, I kind of like that. And then other times I'm frustrated by it, because it seems like they could make their case so effectively and they just don't. Maybe I'm missing something, but
maybe they don't.
I think you're right. But
Maybe they don't want
in a
to.
way, it's probably the problem. If you get too good at the information war, then you become a victim of your own propaganda, which I think we see happening in both Ukraine and the West. Maybe it's good that the Russians are bad at this. It means that they're firmly reality-based.
Yeah, I mean, and also maybe the Russians just don't want to either, because there's everything's going well for them. Let Europe think that Russia is about to collapse and is weak, and that they'll keep on spending more and more money until their economies collapse and they have some type of social revolt, or it's like let them keep doing it. It's like because maybe they don't want this peace deal. It's like, okay, if this messaging was very effective, and then all of a sudden people say, okay, yeah, there is a real Nazi problem. We've been supporting Nazis for the past 4 years. Oh my God, we got to stop. And then everything ends. Then they'll like, okay, we just let's draw the borders here. But maybe they're like, let's just keep it going. They're just digging a hole, and then this way we can secure more territory, have a bigger buffer zone, Yeah,
well, I think that's right. I mean, I know that Putin himself has been asked, why don't you put more effort into the information war? And he's kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, they're just so good at that. We don't even try.
Right.
And they say, and I guess he's probably made the assessment that maybe it just doesn't really matter in the end. It's just like reality wins out. And, if our own people and the people outside of the Western information sphere understand what we're doing, that's all we need.
Right. And at the end of the day, it'll just make the West look so bad. When this is finally over, when it's all said and done, it's like, oh, damn it. We were the bad guys. We were supporting the Nazis for the past 4 years. It's just the irony, just the rhetoric from the West constantly. It's like, oh, we got to be Churchill, So how do we support these Nazis? What do we do? It's silly. Yeah. It really is insane. Okay, well, I think we can end it there, Dad.
Okay.
All right. Happy New Year, everybody. We did it a whole year. I think we got close to 50,000 subscribers. So that's great. People like what you have to say, Dad. That's great.
And what you have to say.
Oh, thanks. Boy. Okay. All right. Everybody, thank you so much. Have a great 2026. We'll see you next year. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.